Department at the North Central Texas Council of Governments, or NCTCOG. This webinar is hosted by NCTCOG and was prepared in cooperation with TCEQ and US EPA. Some background on what NCTCOG is. NCTCOG is a voluntary association of local governments. It is one of 24 regional councils in Texas. As part of NCTCOG's water quality management planning work, we host webinars on water quality issues quarterly. If you have ideas for future topics for these webinars, we'd love to hear them. Please feel free to send them to me. My email address is shown at the bottom of your screen. It is aknox@nctcog.org, and I've included it in the chat. At this time, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with you. Today's webinar will go until 11:30 Central Standard Time. We'll hear from three presentations from 4 speakers. After each presentation, there'll be some time for questions, and I'll share instructions on how to submit your questions in just a little bit. Follow-up emails from today's webinars will be sent to those of you who registered. If you didn't register but would still like to receive follow-up emails with the materials from today, please just email me and let me know at that email below. This webinar has been approved for 1.5 continuing education credits by the Texas Floodplain Management Association. If you need a certificate as proof of your attendance, you can email me at anox@nctcog.org, and I'd be happy to get that to you. The presentation slides and recording from this webinar will be posted under the green banner called Webinars on NCTCOG's website here, which I'm including in the chat. The agenda for today is as follows. Today we will hear from Clingenpeel, who will present regional flood planning and assessment of future conditions. Doctors Kathy Jack and Fouad Jaber, who will present green stormwater infrastructure for urban flood resilience, opportunity analysis in Dallas, Texas, and Kevin Smith, who will share with us how regional water planning groups plan for drought resilience in an uncertain future. Now I'd like to introduce our first speaker for today. Glenn Clingenpeel is the Executive Manager of Technical Services and Basin Planning for the Trinity River Authority, where he has worked for 25 years, serving in a variety of positions. He holds degrees in biology, ecology, environmental services, French language, and business administration. Throughout his career, Glenn has been active in numerous organizations, including the Texas Water Conservation Association, NCTCOG, the Galveston Bay Council, and Water Environment Association of Texas. He currently serves as the chair for the Region 3 Trinity Flood Planning Group that developed the first ever flood plan for the Trinity River Basin. And now, Glenn, you may begin your presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Alyssa. And just want to make sure everybody can hear me correctly. So, Alyssa, if you can let me know. All right, we're good to go. Okay, yes. Yeah, so we're going to talk about flood planning this morning. And if you go ahead and advance the next slide, the topics I want to cover in general, and I'll try to come back to this issue of how we're planning for a more resilient future. I think a lot of that's going to be pretty intuitive because it's kind of baked into the drought or flood planning, the flood planning process. But the topics that I'd like to hit this morning is just to go over the origin of the state flood plan. And I know that you all are probably pretty familiar with it, but I think there's a pretty interesting backstory that kind of sets all this up that I think helps to put it in perspective. I'd like to go over that real quickly. We'll talk about the regional flood planning group, the plan that we came out, and with the amended plan that was finally adopted here pretty recently. So next slide, please. We'll go ahead and jump right into it. Okay. Yeah, so this picture is probably starting to look pretty familiar. I was thinking about that this morning as I was kind of trying to put my thoughts together. In fact, you know, we had this very bad drought between 2011 or 2010, depending upon when you start that clock, ran through 2014. And in a lot of parts of the state, that became the new drought of record. And 2011 was the hottest, driest year that we had here in the Trinity Basin. Statewide, if you look statewide, I think 2012 actually beat it. But 2011 was pretty bad. It was extremely hot. It was extremely dry. And this year is starting to look a lot like it. As a matter of fact, I just ran an analysis based on a question I got a couple of weeks ago. Somebody was just asking me out of the blue, how is 2023 comparing to 2011? Hadn't thought about that. So went ahead and ran the numbers, and we're actually, if you look at the cumulative rainfall starting in January, just kind of adding it up as you go through, we're actually lower than we were at this time in 2011. And that's despite the fact that, and I know I'm supposed to be talking about flooding, and I promise we'll get there, but this is an interesting backstory too. That's despite the fact that we're now in strong El Nino condition. And I think the reason for that is because we were transitioning in the spring. In the springtime is typically when we see a lot of the additional rainfall, and unfortunately that means flooding as well, during those El Nino conditions. And then even during El Nino, we can have very hot and dry summers, which is unfortunately what we're seeing right now. Hopefully the fall will bring us some relief in terms of rainfall. Hopefully not so much that we get back into the flood side of the equation, but that's the way that it works here in Texas, and that's a lot of that's driven by that ENSO cycle. So we had this 5-year drought between 2011 and 2014, and it was really bad. Like I said, in some parts of the state, that actually set a new drought of record. And in Texas, when we ask ourselves how bad can things get, and we're looking at a water supply perspective, we look at that drought of the record, and typically that was 1950s, early 50s through 56, 57 here for the Trinity River Basin. So next slide, please. So then we went from 5 years of drought to 5 years of flooding. Go ahead, we've got some animation, so go ahead and click the first one. And it started in 2015, 2016, and by the way, we were in a strong La Nina during the drought years, switched to a very strong El Nino. And not in this presentation, but I do have some graphs that show how dramatic that change was. The picture that you're seeing here is actually a picture of the Trinity River, the river. In places in 2015, it was 5 miles wide. And that was, spilled over into the spring of 2016. Next slide. 2017, we had this little thing called Hurricane Harvey that came ashore and impacted, of course, the city of Houston, but also the lower Trinity River Basin. Go ahead, next one. In 2018, the graph that you're seeing there shows natural or the normal precipitation, and you can see in the spring in this area how much rainfall we had. That's a picture of the Dallas floodway. Go ahead, next one. 2019, we had Tropical Storm Imelda, just insult to injury. So it was a really tough 5 years. But the point here is that we went from 5 years of drought to 5 years of flooding. Next slide, please. And so what that did is it created this very strong perception that something had changed, right? So this is a decade-long period where we began it with drought and immediately went into flooding, and unprecedented flooding in some regards. And so going into the 2019 legislative session, there was a tremendous appetite to do something because everybody recognized there was a problem. We'd had, Harvey, which was absolutely unprecedented and just devastated the Houston area and the lower coastal area. And so the legislature in 2019 passed Senate Bill 8, and that established the first ever state flood plan, and it charged the Texas Water Development Board with standing this up. And I will give them credit because they had a lot of work to do in a very short amount of period of time. So they did a fantastic job standing up this brand new group that had never existed, this brand new process that had never existed before. And so what it did is it created a bottoms-up regional flood planning process that was really modeled after the water flood planning process, which was modeled after the water planning process. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the water planning process, but it is recognized nationally as a very successful program. And part of that, I think, the foundation of that is the fact that it's bottoms up, right? It's not top down. It's not somebody sitting in an ivory tower in a shining city somewhere telling people how much water they need to use. It's the people on the ground saying, okay, here are future projections and so on and so forth. And so this is what we think that we're going to need, and this is how we're going to overcome that. Flood planning process works very similar to that. Obviously, there's some key distinctions, and I'm not really going to get into those today. But again, modeled on the same premise or same foundation. So next slide, please. Okay. Like I said, this is a bottoms-up approach. There are 15 different regional flood planning groups, and they were designated in April of 2020. We convened Region 3 for the first time in October of 2020 with the goal of having our first plan completed by January of 2023. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we were successful in that endeavor. Again, a lot of work to do in not a whole lot of time. And all these plans will then roll up and become part of the state's first ever statewide flood plan. Next slide. This is just a graphic that shows you the location of those 15 different regional flood planning groups spread across the state. You'll notice that the Trinity Basin, all 18,000 square miles of it, is one region. Next slide. So if you were to kind of step back and from a very high level say, okay, well, what are we trying to accomplish in this flood planning process. And there's a lot of different ways that you can describe that. But in my mind, here are kind of the major things that we were trying to accomplish, right? So the first thing we had to do was determine current and future flood risks. And keep in mind, we had about 2 years to do this, okay? And we had 18,000 square miles, so there was a lot of information to digest. Then we had to determine measurable goals, right? So, okay, so here's our current risks. Here's what we think they're going to be in the future. What do we want to achieve? What kind of reductions in flood risk do we want to see? Building on that, then, we evaluated and proposed those flood risk reduction actions. So we've got the goals. Now what actions are going to try to get us there? And then we had to bring all this information together and compile it into a regional report that, again, is going to be combined into that statewide flood plan. Next slide. And this is part of it's supposed to be, right, a 5-year process. Again, we started this in October of 2027, convened, or 2020, it was October 27 of 2020, just to be clear. And again, that draft plan was due by the end of 2022. Basically, we approved it in November 22, was due to the Texas Water Development Board in January of 2023. That gave us less than 2 years to get all this done. But the way that it's supposed to work is a 5-year iterative cycle. And this is, again, very similar to the water planning process. And I think this is part of what makes the process so successful. And I think this is what will make it part of building water resiliency and flood resiliency and resilient communities going into the future, right? Because we do not live in a static environment. And as anybody who lives here knows, we've seen a tremendous amount of growth. We're going to continue to see that into the future. So you've got growth patterns that may be changing, right, for a variety of different reasons that I'll try to touch on in a little bit. You know, we've got weather and climate conditions that are pretty unpredictable and maybe changing as we go into the future. And so there's this having this iterative cycle allows us to make course corrections, to adjust as we go into the future, as we try to build resiliency as we go into the future. So just kind of walking through that, the first thing that we have to do is look at the flood risk analysis, which is that first step that I talked about, the flood risk reduction activities, build that into the plan, then that goes into the state plan, and then we start this cycle all over again. So for Region 3, where we are right now, we've submitted our plan, and we're looking at starting that next cycle. And a lot of people think that, so the plan was approved, all of the plans, all the regional plans were approved a couple weeks ago. I think it was July 25, down at the Texas Water Development Board. Their commission got together. They voted on all of those plans and voted to approve them or adopt them. I can tell you it was a proud moment for everybody that was there. You know, I think it's a heck of an accomplishment for the entire state, and I was very honored and pleased to be a part of that. But like I said there, we can't, you know, pat ourselves on the back. It's not like we've got this report. By the way, here's this report. We can't just take this and stick it on a shelf and say, we've done our job. We immediately have to go back into this process. We have to decide who's going to be continue to be the local sponsor, and that is going to continue to be the Trinity River Authority. We have to go through the consultant acquisition process again. So we've started that. I hope to have a contract in place with the Texas Water Development Board for the next 5 years of funding by the end of this year. And so next year we can really start into this whole process once again and loop into that, what is intended to be that 5-year process. Next slide.
This side looks a little busier, but this side doesn't look too bad.
And I think we've got some talking in the background.
Please just make sure your microphones are muted. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. All right. Very good. So here is just kind of looking back at the Region 3 or the Trinity River Basin. You know, it's 18,000 square miles. And so we've got a lot of territory here that we're working with. And there's a lot of different types of areas within that basin, right? We've got in the upper portion, we've got the Dallas-Fort Worth statistical metropolitan area. I've got 7.8 million. I think that's probably closer to 8 million. You know, Texas is adding about 1,300 people every single day. And the Dallas-Fort Worth area is one of those epicenters for that growth. And so we see a lot of people coming in. And of course, this is a service and technology heavy area. So not a lot of manufacturing, but a lot of development, you know, and a lot of sprawl. You know, there's a lot of concrete. There's a lot of rooftops. There's a lot of urban type flooding. And then we've got, you know, a system of 8 different core reservoirs that have flood control capacity that are built into them. And then we've got the middle part, which is largely agrarian and undeveloped. And then in the lower basin, we even have some rice farming down there. And in terms of flooding, we get it all, right? We get the fluvial flooding up here. We get the river flooding in the middle basin and lower basin. And then we get the tropical storms that come in and really affect the coast, but can also affect us up here as well. Next slide. Yeah, so one of the things that we had to do was, again, look at the current versus the future conditions. And as I was really kind of digesting these slides in preparation for the talk, I realized that this shot here that shows the current conditions versus the future anticipated conditions doesn't really do it justice, because there's really so much we can predict about how that growth is going to occur. I think a density map probably would have been better here. And as you can imagine, there'd be a lot of density growing in the upper basin, and not so much in the middle or lower basin, a little bit, but not so much. One of the things that could change this, and I'll come back to the fact that this is an iterative process and why that is such an intelligent way to go about this, is that, when we went through COVID, I think we proved the technology of remote work. And I think today's meeting is further evidence of that reality. And so we really don't know how growth patterns are going to occur in the future. If hybrid work is really embraced and continues to catch on and take off, we could see a lot more sprawl, right? Instead of building horizontal, we could be building vertically. And this could mean that, people are able to work in remote areas. And so we'll have to see, right? And so we'll have to see going into the future how that manifests. And that 5-year cycle will allow us to adjust to that as we go through these iterative processes. Next slide. So when we're looking at the future conditions, this was a really tough challenge. And again, we had 2 years to do this, 18,000 square miles. So you can imagine we didn't go out there and do detailed hydraulic models of all of the different water bodies. That just simply wasn't possible. We kind of had to look at what was there. And what was there wasn't a whole lot. And so what we decided to do, and anything that we could have done at this stage would have been largely arbitrary, but we needed something to shoot for, some kind of future condition to look at and to evaluate. And so what we decided to do was go with a range. And we decided that an absolute best case scenario, and I'm not saying this is likely, but an absolute best case scenario would be that current conditions stay the same. So your 1% annual chance, which we commonly refer to as the 100-year floodplain, would stay the same. Again, I'm not saying we expected that. That was kind of the best case scenario. Worst case scenario would be in 30 years, and this was a 30-year time horizon that we're looking at, that the current 500-year event, or 0.2% annual chance, that floodplain, the corresponding floodplain to that, would be the future 1% chance. So hopefully that makes sense. So best case scenario, nothing changes. Worst case scenario, the 1% chance would be equivalent to the existing 0.2% chance. So really broadening that floodplain out quite a bit. The challenge then looking further down the road and saying, okay, well, what would the 0.2%, not further down the road, but in terms of probabilities, looking at that current 0.2% or 500-year flood, what's that going to look like? And again, we said best case scenario, nothing changes. But where do you go into the future? Because there aren't a lot of flood maps that say what a 1,000-year event looks like. We did have some hydraulic models, detailed hydraulic models. In looking at that and looking at the average, what it showed was maybe about a 40-foot extension of that, right? So the future condition for the 500-year floodplain was a range from current conditions to 40 feet out from current boundaries. And again, as we get more detailed work, as we get more data and information about how the climate is changing, about how storm intensity is increasing or not, there's pretty good evidence that it is, then we can adjust and we can adapt and we can make better predictions as we go into the future. Next slide. All right, so there's 3 different, and I'm kind of winding down here. I'll move through these last slides pretty quickly. In terms of the recommended actions that we could look at or that we could include in the plan, those come in 3 different flavors: flood management evaluations, strategies, and projects. Evaluations are pretty intuitive. That's a study, right? And nobody likes to hear that we're going to do more studies. Everybody wants projects. Projects are, things that you're putting in the ground, things that you can go out and you can touch and you can feel, that make real differences immediately. But before you can build a project, before you can hit a target, you've got to aim. And again, everybody likes projects, but you're never going to hit the target if you don't aim first. And so there's a real need to fill a lot of the knowledge gaps. And the third category is strategies, right? And I think this was genius on the part of the Texas Water Development Board, because they recognized that not everything was going to be easily put into the bucket of evaluations or projects. And so they came up with this third category that's basically strategies. And strategy is everything that isn't an evaluation or a project. So what is that? Well, it's a public outreach activity. It's flood warning signs. Again, anything that you can't really say is a study or a project. Next slide, please. So when we looked at all of the different studies that were out there, and we cast a really broad net, we actually evaluated over 521 potential studies and came up with a list of 507 that qualified. And so we recommended 507 to go into the plan. We did not prioritize them. We did not say this one is better than that one. We did not say this one has merit, this one doesn't. What we said is, does it qualify? And if it qualified, we included it in the plan. And that's the same for the E's, S's, and P's. Next slide, please. So we looked at over 140 different strategies. 138 of those qualified. Next slide. We ended up looking at over 73 different projects, of which 56 qualified. When we completed our first draft of this plan, the one we submitted to Texas Water Development Board in January, I believe we had 7 projects. We had some additional money that the Texas Water Development Board afforded us or gave to us, and that gave us a little bit more time to move some other projects that may have been evaluations or may not have qualified at all, and qualify them as projects for the plan. And so we ended up with 56 different projects. And right here, the graphic that you see there shows the locations within the Metroplex. Because we were able to include more, I should have updated this graphic. We do have some that are located in the lower basin as well. Next slide. And that really, and I'm going to end this talk pretty abruptly because I am out of time. But hopefully that gives you a pretty good overview of the planning process, what we did here in the basin, hopefully a little bit of insight into how that's going to help us build resilient communities. And with that, I'll stop talking and ask questions or answer questions.
Thank you so much, Glenn, for that presentation. Now is time for questions from the audience. You can ask your question one of 2 ways. You can use the raise hand feature, and I will call on you to unmute your mic and ask your question, or you can type your question directly into the chat box and I will read it.
And I did notice that Stephanie Griffin is online. She was the lead consultant for this project. And so if there's a detailed technical question, I may drag her in, Alyssa, if that's all right.
Oh, wonderful. That'd be great. Okay, we have a question from Amy. What is meant by a project being qualifying?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So in the rules that were laid out as we were developing what this whole process is going to look like, there were certain criteria that had to be met. One of the heaviest, and I won't go through the whole list, but one of the biggest hurdles to becoming a project was that you had to show no negative impacts above or below the project area, right? And that's a really high hurdle to cross, right? That's a pretty heavy burden because you had to demonstrate, for instance, that your project wasn't going to increase flooding downstream. And I think this makes sense, and I understand the intent of the legislature in requiring that, because that was passed down directly from the legislative rules or law that was passed. And so what you didn't want to do was have a community that, for instance, wanted a trapezoidal concrete line ditch, right? Now that may solve your flooding problem because it's going to move water really fast and get it out of your area. But what it's going to do is it's going to take that hydrograph downstream and it's going to compress it. So that will actually make flooding worse downstream. Or if you had some big detention project that could potentially move that upstream as well. So that's what's meant by qualifying, is there were a list of different criteria that had to be met in order to qualify according to the Texas Water Development Board rules.
Okay, I see another question in the chat. Did you look at interaction between flood and droughts? For example, use of floodwaters to recharge aquifers and storage. Future climate may see more intensification of floods and droughts.
Yes, it may. One of the things that we were charged with by the ledge was looking at whether or not flood control projects could serve as water supply projects. And I think that's one of those things that makes it sounds good on paper or as a thought, but when you really start thinking through it, it's far more complicated than that. And the opportunity, yes, the answer is we did look at this. The opportunities to marry those two together are pretty limited. And the reason for that, well, there's a lot of complicated reasons, but if we look at something that's very similar or simple, like a reservoir, right? And that's basically what reservoirs do. They catch and they store water. A reservoir can operate in one of two capacities. It can be full, in which case you've got water supply, or it can be empty, in which case you have flood storage capacity. They cannot exist in those two conditions. Now, once you fill up the flood storage, so if you look at the 8 reservoirs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that have flood storage capacity that are operated by the Corps of Engineers, they really have 2 different pools. They have a water conservation pool that's water supply, and they have a flood storage pool on top of that that can catch those flood flows. Once that flood pool fills up, they have to empty that as quickly as possible. That makes it very difficult to opportunistically use that water while it's in storage because their objective is to get it out, so they've got that storage. And if you look at 2015, that storage was filled and they were trying to move it out as quickly as they could without flooding people downstream when Tropical Storm Bill came along. So we already had all that capacity filled, and that really limited their ability to mitigate flooding from Tropical Storm Bill. If you look at like aquifer storage and recovery, recharge, yeah, maybe you can catch that, but now you've got quality issues. You've got the infrastructure that would be required to move large volumes of water into pretty unique aquifer strata that could even accept it. So you've got to treat it. You've got to have the standby capacity. So unfortunately, it's a lot more complicated, but it's something that we're going to continue to look at.
Great. We have time for maybe like one more quick question. If not, we can move on to our next speaker. I'd like to introduce Dr. Catherine Jack and Dr. Fouad Jaber. Dr. Catherine Jack serves as the Texas Climate Program Director for the Nature Conservancy in Texas, where she leads the chapter strategy for climate adaptation and mitigation. She supports several initiatives focused on addressing institutional barriers to nature-based solutions for flood mitigation. Dr. Jack has degrees from Cornell University, Humboldt State University, as well as a PhD in environmental science from the University of North Texas. She is a fellow at SMU's Hunt Institute for Environment and Humanity and an associate graduate faculty member at the University of North Texas. Dr. Fouad Jaber is a professor and integrated water resources management extension specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. Dr. Jaber holds degrees in agriculture and irrigation engineering from the American University of Beirut and received his PhD in 2001 in agricultural and biological engineering from Purdue University. He's been conducting research and extension programs related to green stormwater infrastructure, nature-based systems, stream restoration, and climate change resiliency studies since 2002. Dr. Jaber is also a professional engineer in the state of Texas. And now, Kathy and Fouad, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Alyssa. Can you hear me? Are we good?
Yes,
okay.
I can.
Well, great. Okay, well, thanks so much for the opportunity to share this analysis. I noticed that Sue Alvarez is listening in, and this is one of the few times in the past we've had the chance to include her in her time with the City of Dallas as a partner in this analysis. But I'm glad she can also help us answer any questions at the end. So we're zooming in. So starting with the basin, with the first presentation with Glenn, zooming into the red area that we saw on so many of the maps in the prior presentation into the urban and urbanizing area. We focus this analysis on the potential for green stormwater infrastructure to enhance urban flood resilience. Next slide, please. So there were several partners. TNC worked closely with Fouad and Fouad's team, Bardia Haidari and Victoria Prideaux, now Prideaux-Wen. And this analysis took us a couple of years. She's now been married and had a child, so this was a long study together. But we partnered very closely with the City of Dallas, and it was essential to have that partnership because we needed to use, and Fouad will walk us through this, some of their digitized data and create digitized data out of their plots. So we worked with both the Office of Environmental Quality and Sustainability, to support their goals for sustainable water management, and then also the Dallas water utilities to support their goals for flood resilience. And then we also brought in and collaborated with the Trust for Public Land, who helped us think through some of the spatial analysis that Fouad will also walk us through. Okay, next slide, please. And we saw an image similar to this in the previous presentation. Next slide, please. And this map may look familiar also. So I'm going to first kind of frame up some of the challenges. Why did we even initiate this study? The first one is, yes, we are losing farmland and natural areas very quickly throughout the entire state. We lose approximately 240,000 acres a year in Texas to development, and it is worse around the urbanizing areas. This red area, as we all know, is Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, the fastest growing metropolitan area in the United States. We also have at the southern end of the basin, Houston is outside of the basin, but draws 80% of its water from within the basin. So we have a challenge as we're losing our green space and replacing those green spaces with impervious cover. Next slide, please. We also are facing, as discussed prior, challenges with climate change, with too little water and huge increases in the amount and frequency of rain events. The state climatologist predicts that by 2036, flooding in our cities will be estimated to increase by 50%, more frequency. That's frequency, not amount. So we're trying to look at how to improve not only our usual flood infrastructure, but get creative with enhancing even natural flood infrastructure. Next slide, please. So this was provided, and I'm sorry, Sue, she's going to know that we should have an updated. We need to update the slide. There's been bond propositions since 2017, but the point of this slide remains, which is in cities like Dallas, the stormwater infrastructure was built for previous conditions, previous populations, and we have outgrown and outpaced the ability of our stormwater infrastructure in Dallas and in other cities to manage, even without climate change, clearing our roads and managing the stormwater that's falling. But now with climate change, we're just having increasing challenges managing our urban flooding, distributed flooding. So, and we don't have the funding to upgrade just from a hardscape perspective. We don't have the funding to manage upgrades, which are more expensive when you've already developed your landscape. Next slide. This is an illustration. This is a real photo, not an illustration, a real photo of what is happening more frequently in some of our cities. And you can see here, literally, that it is making, during storm events, besides losing property and increasing risk, you have our emergency services unable to make their pathway to provide emergency services. So this is a risk situation as well as a nuisance situation. We used to call urban flooding nuisance flooding, but it's more than that. It's becoming detrimental. Next slide, please. So the opportunity, and this was framed up with Fouad, cities across the world have been using green stormwater infrastructure, which are engineered plant soil solutions to recreate hydrological processes to improve stormwater management in urbanized watersheds. This has become a more common practice around urban watersheds, but primarily the benefit that is usually intended is water quality. And what Fouad proposed was, we know, based on his existing research, that they can provide flood resilience benefits. But the city of Dallas and other cities around the state had been asking questions about what volume can be captured. What does that look like throughout our problematic watersheds? Where would you prioritize investment in the city landscape? Where would you start? What volume could be captured and at what cost compared to upgrading gray infrastructure? So that was the starting point for our analysis. Next slide, please. And the next few slides just highlight the city of Dallas had been working on reducing barriers and implementing green stormwater infrastructure, primarily for water quality benefits for many times, including partnering through the COG to adopt voluntarily the ISWIM recommendations into their drainage manual. So there were several steps that already had been taken by the city of Dallas. Next slide, please. Including, previous slide. Most recently, they had adopted a comprehensive environmental climate action plan that had several goals and places throughout the plan that teed up the role of green infrastructure, blue-green infrastructure, nature-based solutions to enhance flood resilience. Next slide, please. So this is the research question. Where can green stormwater infrastructure most effectively enhance urban flood management within Dallas, Texas, considering cost, capacity, and future impacts of climate change? And Fouad will walk you through that. His team used US EPA SWIM version 5.1, and we also used spatial analysis to help to answer these questions. Next slide. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over here to Fouad.
Thank you very much. So yes, after we came up with the research question that Kathy just showed in the previous slide, we started looking for data to do our analysis. And the first thing we did is work with the city of Dallas to obtain as much stormwater network data that we could have. And in the left slide, you can see in the green is the areas where we're able to find data. Some of these gray watersheds were only partially in the city of Dallas, so we didn't have data for the parts that are outside, so we excluded those. And then some of the white areas you see within are sites where, for various reasons, we didn't obtain the stormwater network data. And so then we ran the model with the data we were given, and you see on the right, we identified with orders of severity where the inlets of the stormwater network can flood, and therefore their watershed were considered these opportunity watersheds where we could put green stormwater infrastructure. In the left slide, you can see the 5 Mile Creek here is highlighted because in the slides after that, we're going to focus on the process of how we did this for 5 Mile Creek. Next slide, please. So as I spoke for the top map that you can see for 5 Mile Creek is where we went and obtained stormwater network data. The circular points are inlets, stormwater inlets in the curve that you can see when you're walking, and these inlets are connected by lines, which are the stormwater pipes in the system. After that, we ran the SWIM model, which is a model developed by EPA that allows you to model both surface runoff and stormwater network runoff. And we identified which of all these dots that you can see in the top slide, which ones are the ones that are where water is backing up. And then we did a procedure to figure out the severity of the backup. And that's why you see yellow being minor backup and dark green being severe backup. And then from that step, we identified these watersheds that feed into these specifically selected or found inlets, and these are our opportunity watersheds where we can put green stormwater infrastructure. Next slide, please. And so we ran the model for several storms. So we ran it for the 2-year, the 10-year, and the 100-year storm. And these are the top 3 maps that you can see. And you can see that with the increasing size of the storm, of course, more and more watershed starts flooding, and the severity of the flooding also increases. What we also did is we went and did a full analysis of the what is it called, the International Commission on Climate Change data and their ensemble modeling. And we analyzed the data and obtained data so we can estimate the 2-year, 10-year, and 100-year storm in 2045. And these were increased storm. And then we ran the model for those two. And you can see, if you look from up to down, you can see how for various storms, there's increase as a result of the increase in the storm size due to climate change. So you can look both horizontally and vertically and see that the change in the 2-year change is minor. A few of the watershed go from yellow to dark red, but then in the 100-year, we have some severe changes as a result of that increase in storm size. Next slide, please. Some of the findings we found was that the storm size that will increase, the 10-year storm of 2045 is going to be very similar to the current 100-year storm. So that's 3 inches more of rainfall, and that's something that we need to account for. And the 100-year storm, of course, increases a lot. And at the same time, we saw that climate change is going to result in 26% more inlets or hotspots that are going to be flooded as a result of changes in the precipitation due to climate change. Next slide, please. Once we've estimated these watershed, what we wanted to see, where can we put green stormwater infrastructure? Where is a potential good location for green stormwater infrastructure in the city? And so we went up and came up with general rules that we based on stuff that we have done in Dallas personally. We did literature reviews from stuff that happened in Seattle to New York, anywhere in the US. And in addition, we looked at regulation and permitted applications, such as can you use a right-of-way for a rain garden or not, and how much of it is typically used. And with these regulations, we came up with a set of rules of where can we put bioretention areas, where can we put rain gardens, which are basically just depressions to hold water, and where can we put rainwater harvesting systems. These are the 3 practices that we looked for in this study. Of course, there are others like green roofs, permeable pavement, but we did not consider them for this study for various reasons in here. And so you can look at the map, and we used spatial analysis to identify within these watersheds where are potential locations for bioretentions, for rain gardens, and for rainwater harvesting. Next slide, please. And so this is the stuff that we found. So for the 2-year storm, we found out that the bioretention can hold 78.4 million gallons of water out of 111 million gallons that can be totally held. For the 10-year storm, it's 135 of 191. And for the 100-year storm, we could hold 200 out of 284 possible. So bioretention did look like the most effective capture for your money, but the other 2 are not little. Even though they're much less than bioretention, we still were able to hold considerable amount of water in those systems. So combined, they held a very large amount of runoff for these storms. Next slide, please. And so to look at overall of the flooding, how much can be retained with GSI, for the 2-year storm, 30.6% of the total flood water could have been captured or could be captured in green stormwater infrastructure in the watershed of these hotspots inlets. For the 10-year storm, it's around 24.7%. And for the 100-year storm, it's 16.9%. For the 100-year storm, we also compared it to gray infrastructure, because most of the gray infrastructure is designed for the 100-year storm. And we found out that the gray infrastructure alone, even if it's upgraded to the maximum potential capacity of pipe sizes, it would capture 24.6% of that flood water, meaning that a combination of the green infrastructure and the gray infrastructure can give us the best retention, which is up to 41.5% of the total capacity. The other thing we looked at is also the average cost, which is a huge deal, because this 16.9% that we would capture with the green infrastructure would cost $2 per gallon while gray infrastructure upgrade would cost $10.6 per gallon. So that's 5 times more for the same gallon. And when we combine both together, the average cost per gallon was 7.1. What this tells us is that when you go to a watershed that's been flooding frequently, the first thing you should do is put these 16.9%. Put green stormwater infrastructure, because it's going to be the cheaper approach to retention. And then when you reach your capacity, start looking at gray infrastructure to try to meet your flooding. Next slide. And just we showed, after we ran the model, we compared the current map to the map of flooding as a result of increasing green stormwater infrastructure. So the numbers I talked about in the previous slide only talk about total volume. But in reality, we found that a huge number of the watershed that were in dark red became yellow. So actually, there was a lot of reduction in many of the watersheds. So not only we're reducing the total volume, but we're also decreasing the severity and the number of inlets that are flooding as a result. We also did a few runs for specific sub-watershed to see the hydrograph. And on your left, bottom left, you can see the comparison of a hydrograph in one of the sub-watersheds for the 10-year storm. I think this was done. And you can see not only we reduced the total volume, but we also we delayed the peak and reduced the peak as a result of just putting green stormwater infrastructure in these systems. Next slide. And I'm going to give it back to Kathy at this point.
Okay, we have a couple more slides. Thanks, Fouad. So there's a couple of summary slides. This one was immediately upon completing this, and actually while we were wrapping it down, because we were partnering with the city, we were sharing all of the data with the city, and we have shared the maps for all the scenarios with the city of Dallas so that they can now, regardless of which department may be looking at this challenge, they can include this as a part of their analysis. And right now, the Planning and Urban Design Department at the city is looking at these maps as they consider updating their parking ordinance, given that the finding was parking lot bioretention may be a really important tool. And then also including the data as one of many sources of data as they update their comprehensive plan. Because we didn't want the study to be completed and then not useful as the city starts to consider future investment. We also produced a web app. It's linked in the resources that'll go out after, because this was a purely hydrological study. But when you look at where would you prioritize investment in some of these systems, there's other factors that of course matter. Who's living there, who owns the property, what is the process that may be different depending on land uses, what are the zoning requirements. All of these things matter when you really get down to actual investment. So we created a web app that would facilitate sort of planning level conversations with the city, and that's accessible as well. It includes socio-demographic data. Next slide, please. And this is just a snapshot from that web app just to show what happens when you overlay, for example, in the 5 Mile Creek watershed, where several of our partners are looking at increasing green space and investing in a variety of measures. On the left, we have those hotspots more visible, and then on the right, you see it overlaid with the US EPA Social Vulnerability Index to see that this is an area where there's multiple concerns. Okay, next slide, please. And also, Fouad's team has continued to take some of this research and we published. So we're really proud of this publication in the Journal of Hydrology for anybody who wants to read the technical, some of the technical summary of this research. Next slide. So I would say I just want to end with some of the highest level takeaways for me as a partner who's concerned not just at the data, but how do you use the data? Obviously, climate change will continue to exacerbate urban flooding, and we believe that this data can show that green stormwater infrastructure has a place in these planning discussions. One of the biggest takeaways for me
were or are some of the barriers to implementation of GSI in Dallas? That's an excellent question. Thank you.
I think we can all take a couple, and honestly, not to put Sue on the spot, but she would be the best voice. She was our partner at the city, our lead partner at the city. What we had been shared at the beginning, the whole purpose of conducting this was that the city staff needed data. You know, they needed to understand, one, with limited budget, where would you prioritize and how much would we see as a benefit? Because the conversations to that point had been about water quality, not about flood mitigation. And I see Sue is coming off mute, so please pipe in.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest challenges actually is policy-based. The city as a whole has is designated as having a higher flood standard under FEMA, so that all design is required to be the 100-year design. As most of you know, GSI is typically 1.5 to 2-year design. And so the thought of implementing it in addition to or in lieu of traditional 100-year design gray infrastructure was a challenge. And so where this work, I think, is pretty important is it shows that GSI can help augment traditional gray infrastructure, and it provides that factor of safety on the frequency of flooding without it. That one map with the blue and the green is one of my favorite graphics ever, because in essence, the water flows from the brand new blue areas that has standard 100-year flood criteria down to the older parts of the city that have 5-year. Realistically, the city is not going to be able to construct that $2.4 or $3 billion worth of infrastructure in traditional gray. And so that's where the planning department is looking at, well, what other things can we do to influence an urban flood response so that we're not having the really high peaks. And green infrastructure is a fabulous tool for kind of taking the edge off, both with respect to the additional rainfall amounts expected in a future flood scenario, but also with how the cover in the watersheds behaves to that rainfall. And so if you can pull in some green infrastructure to kind of slow things down, this study shows that it can be really helpful.
Great. Thank you so much, Sue. I'm seeing some great discussion in the chat, so please feel free to continue that. But I would like to introduce our final speaker for today. We have Kevin Smith, who is a planner with the Texas Water Development Board. Kevin has 20 years of experience in development of water and wastewater projects here in the state of Texas. He has been a regional water planner with the Texas Water Development Board since 2019. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Texas A&M University. Kevin, you may begin your presentation.
Thank you, Alyssa. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to the group here today. So I just wanted to talk about uncertainty, kind of what that is, what that looks like in the context of regional water planning, and then specifically tie that to Region C, which is the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and tie that specifically to drought and how the regional planning group, how Region C prepares for drought. So next slide, please. Thank you. So, uncertainty, how I like to kind of think about it, I guess paraphrasing Donald Rumsfeld here, but it's kind of these known unknowns, these factors that influence the accuracy of, our planning, but may be, difficult to quantify. You'll see there, I've got there's 4, bolded bullets, and those are kind of high level, the regional water planning process, the steps involved. And so, the first one there, we've got population. There will be a projection on the population. This year we had a census year, so we have fresh census data. And then we've got per capita use. And so basically, real simplifying it here, we'll take the population, we'll put that per capita use on those numbers, and you'll come up with a demand. And then the planning groups also do a water analysis. They do water modeling. So they'll do analysis to kind of come up with a amount of available water supply and availability. And, real simple, if the supply is less than the demand, you have a need. And so if there's a need, then you will have to have a strategy, what we call strategies or projects, that would need to address that need. And then that final bullet there, just trying to tie it all to future drought conditions there. And so, you'll see underneath those bolded, I've got kind of just some factors that influence all of those steps in the process. And, they're probably not exhaustive. We could probably, include other ones. But I think those are kind of the critical ones, specifically when we're thinking about regional water planning. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, high level, how do the planning groups, how does the regional water planning process try to mitigate this uncertainty in the planning process? So, the first one there, population and municipal water demand. So when we look at water use, when we look at water use, the board, uses historical data, specifically on water use. And what that's going to be is annually we get water use surveys from, water entities, retail suppliers. And, we try to base it on historical data. Now, we understand that there are data limits. Just for an example, the water use surveys are, self-supplied. And so there could be errors in how it's reported. Also, everything we do is in the context of the drought record. So maybe the 5-year period that we're looking at for the baseline was a wet year and not necessarily a dry year. And so to kind of mitigate that, the regional water plans, which feeds the state water plans, those are re-examined, and those come out every 5 years. And so that just gives the planning groups, a chance to make corrections, revisions, and just, use the most relevant and available data. So on bullet two there on the water supply. So I mentioned in regional water planning, everything we do is in the context of the drought of record. Specifically for water supply, when the regional water planning groups are doing their water availability analysis, they're using the TCEQ's WAMs, water availability models, and the hydrology in those WAMs does include the drought of record. So there's kind of some built-in conservative, we're looking at basically the worst documented, condition of drought when we look at the available water supply. And when those regional water planning groups are reporting that availability and supply, they're reporting the firm yield, which, would be all of the water in a potential water in a reservoir available. But they do have the flexibility. They do have the option to use like a safe yield, which generally is going to be a 1 year, safe supply of additional water, again, in the context of the drought record. Next slide. Thank you. So, mitigating strategy implementation. So the regional water plans and state water plans has, a long list of strategies and projects to address needs. But, sometimes, those projects might be modified, or they just turn out not to be feasible. And so, one thing that the planning groups do is they have the ability, they have the option to put as many, strategies as they feel should be in their plan. They're not necessarily tied to just, what the need is, and you have to have that exact specific strategy supply. So they do have the flexibility to have additional projects and strategies. They also can have alternative strategies. I think an example of that would be is maybe you had a recommended strategy that you knew, was feasible, but there were a lot of contingencies involved. And so maybe if some of those contingencies fell through, you would have an alternative that could just, replace that. Or maybe you had a strategy that going in, you knew maybe it was feasible, but maybe again, there were contingencies, and maybe you just want to kind of see if it holds up And so maybe once it does, and then that alternative could become a recommended strategy. Or like I was saying, if you had a recommended strategy that maybe you knew wasn't going to potentially be feasible, maybe if you reconfigure it, you would have that as an alternate strategy. And then finally, trying to tie this to drought. So in that last bullet there, the planning groups, they use projections to when they're looking at calculating their available water supply. They're looking at climatic projections. I think that where you're going to see that mostly is in wholesale water providers, major water providers in the regions when they do their availability analysis for like their long-term plans. That's when I think you'll see that. And that does get carried over into the regional water plans. Generally, Region C specifically, the major water provider has certain assumptions and are using certain projections when they calculate their water availability. Certainly that has an input and an influence when a regional water plan is looking at how they want to model the availability for the reservoirs in the region and potential future supply for reservoirs that might be strategies in the plan. And then that second sentence there, and we'll talk about this on the next slide, but the Water Board is currently consulting with the state climatologists to receive information and projections that could be used to identify regions of the state that more likely or not would be more likely to experience severe drought and severe flooding. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that the board is working with the state climatologists. So that first bullet there, there was actually in 2022, the Sunset Commission had a recommendation, and I think the language there is straight from the report, but there was a recommendation directed by the Sunset Commission that the board work with the state climatologists to just look at parts of the state that could experience severe drought or excessive rainfall. Like I said, I'm speaking in the context of water supply and drought, but this also was applicable to flood planning as well. So the board was directed to work with the state climatologists, but prior to that directive, the board has been working with the state climatologist, Mr. John Nielsen Gammon, on climate-related science and uncertainty. I think an example I'd use would be, I know that in the flood, the recent flood regional plans and the flood state water plan, there were, I believe there were precipitation trends that were developed, and those were provided for the flood groups if they wanted to use those or not, when they looked at developing their plans. And, I would characterize it as, in the context of water supply, there's always been communication between the board and the board and regional planning, science and conservation on our surface water folks, and the directive really just kind of increases and kind of sets a schedule, maybe sets some goals for how that communication and what could be produced, kind of like actual deliverables. I know that there have been, meetings are ongoing. I think since September of last year, there's been 10 meetings between the board and the state climatologist. I can't really speak to specifics on what's being discussed. It's ongoing, it's still being developed. I know that, there's a lot of talk around developing projections on evaporation rates for reservoirs, surface water supplies. And then just kind of on that last bullet there, we're in our current planning cycle that ends in 2026 for the regional planning groups. And, any information that could be developed. It wouldn't be available. We're not looking that this would be available for this planting cycle. It looks like if it was to be something that would be used in state and regional planning, it would probably be applicable for this next cycle. And certainly, stakeholder input would be involved in that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to kind of tie this to Region C, so, kind of on the map there on the left side, that's just the boundaries for Region C. It might be hard to see, but there's that, the lighter gray central area, that would be the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. And, on the right there, I've got the 16 counties from the North Central Texas COG, and the red ones are, I think it's 10 of 16. And just those red ones are counties that are actually in Region C and in the boundary of the COG, just to give you an idea of kind of the crossover between the two. Next slide. Thank you. This slide, population in Region C. So in regional water planning, we look at a 50-year planning horizon. You can see there that there's an estimate for the population for Region C in 2020 of, just short of 8 million people. And I think really the takeaway from this slide is that, within the planning horizon, we're almost looking at a doubling of the population in Region C. Next slide. Thank you. So this next slide here is just trying to show water use in Region C. So I think, can we go back? I think we might have missed one slide. Okay, I'm sorry, go forward. I'm sorry, okay. So this graph is trying to show just water use in the region. And so if you'll look, and it might be hard to see, but you've got the vertical kind of bar graphs there in blue. And I think 2008 is that first year there. And so basically you can see kind of a wet year for those first 3 years. And then, the drop off from the drought from 2011 to 2015. And then this slow kind of, gradual increase in rainfall. That data is from a rain gauge at the DFW airport. But what you can kind of see there is that, you've got a wet period, a dry period, and then another wet period. But, looking at the yellow line is like a annual, water use and GPCD for Region C. And then there's like a 5-year trailing average there in that black dotted line. But basically, you can see that even in wet and dry conditions, water use in Region C has been steadily declining over the past, 10 years there. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we looked at population, we've looked at water use, and, I just wanted this slide, I just want folks to see that you've got those, vertical bar graphs. Those are water supply, available water supplies in Region C. You can see that they're kind of divided up in colors there. The dark blue would be reservoirs in Region C. There's like that light tan there. That's reuse. You've got groundwater in the lighter blue at the top there. But you see the supplies in the region, and then you see that black line, which is increasing as you go out into the decades, and that is projected demand. And that pretty much follows what we saw on, the population growth, kind of a linear demand pattern as well. And I think the obvious takeaway is existing supply for the region over the next 50 years is not going to meet projected demand. Next slide. And, this slide here, we talked about available supplies. So that first column there, just to kind of give you a scale of, and you've got, the major water providers in the region in that first column. And that second column, you kind of get a scale in acre feet, the available supplies from current sources. And then on that third column there, projected strategy supply from strategies in the plan. that would provide supply for the major water providers there in the first column. And so you can see, kind of for the top ones there, you got Dallas, Tarrant Regional, North Texas. They're basically looking to double their supply, which I think kind of tracks with what we saw on the doubling of the population as a whole in the region. Next slide. Okay, so I guess finally here, how do we kind of tie this and talk about drought? So, and to be clear, in Region C, how they kind of define the drought of record. It's a period where a reservoir has the least amount of water in it under an assumed demand. So, the drought of record for most supplies in Region C did occur in, the drought of the 50s. The recent droughts, early 2000s, this most recent one, I think we're all familiar with, from 2011 to 2015. They did have significant kind of reductions in a lot of the reservoirs in Region C. But you'll see on that third bullet there that Jim Chapman, Cooper Lake, and the Sulphur River Basin did actually experience a new drought of record. Again, that was for the assumed demand. It was the lowest that it had been. And that was a reduction from the last regional water plan. And then likewise, strategies for, surface water strategies in the Sulphur River Basin in the Region C plan, those were reduced from the last plan as well. Next slide. Okay, so we've talked about the drought of record. How do the regional planning groups plan for and consider droughts worse than the drought of record? So this last legislative session, House Bill 1565, that codified that the regional water planning groups may plan for conditions worse than a drought of record. As you'll see when we kind of go down this slide, they've indirectly really been doing this already, but this just codified that they could do that. That second bullet there, so now that they can plan for a drought worse than a drought of record, the board had just provided some guidance on how the planning group should do that. And so in this cycle's regional water plans, there'll be a new subsection that'll talk about droughts worse than drought of record, if applicable, if the planning groups choose to talk about that. And then the regional water plans will just need to summarize what those additional measures not included in the plan could be during a drought worse than a drought of record. And some of those, looking at bullet number 3 there, and like I said, the planning groups have always really indirectly been doing this already. And so, some of the examples is, when they do the water availability, they're required to do a firm yield, but Region C for sure, I'm pretty sure that all the planning groups do this, but, use of a safe yield, even use of safety factors, or maybe you have a percentage reserve in your reservoirs, are used for water availability modeling. I think we've talked about this already, but the planning groups are free to have strategies beyond just, what the identified needs are. I think that's a pretty common practice with the planning groups. And then I think I'd mentioned this also, but, the major water providers, the wholesale water providers, when they look at their planning and they do their water availability modeling, use of climatic projections, a lot of the times they really are looking at droughts worse than drought of record, and those are carried in their long-range plans, and those are carried over into the regional water plans. Next slide. So, so how do in Region C, how are water providers, retail water suppliers dealing with drought? So this is a TCQ requirement, Texas Administrative Code, but drought contingency plans are required for wholesale, retail public water suppliers, irrigation districts, applicants for new water rights. And these DCPs are reviewed every 5 years. In Region C, most of the major water providers, you can see them there, they share consistent drought consistency plans with 3-year stages and uniform irrigation restrictions. That was like a regional push to have these uniform DCPs where you're using like a 3-stage, which really kind of elevates when you need to start hitting those irrigation restrictions, versus DCPs that had maybe 6 or 7 or 8 stages. And then again, to uniform them, the actual restrictions, and the restrictions are really efficient, restrictions that will get to reducing demand. Those 3 stages, it's basically limiting the first stage, limiting irrigation. The second one is kind of a harder limit on irrigation. And then like the 3rd stage is a final, with some exceptions, no more, outdoor irrigation. That's something a little more direct than, say, a tiered billing on water use, which, encourages demand reduction, but it's not really this kind of direct, efficient restriction. And then finally, on that last bullet there, during the regional water planning process, Region C collects DCPs. They actually, in this last regional water plan, were able to get 63 DCPs from entities, and they do have a database. Those are all, I think it's actually Appendix M in the regional water plan, where it summarizes and categorizes all those DCPs for those 63 entities. And I think this is the final slide here. So, or I'm sorry, second to last. I know that's hard to see, but I just wanted to kind of give folks an idea of what in those plans, what some of the measures are there. At the top of the list, it's hard to see, but it's, restrictions on irrigation use. And then that second column there, the percentage of those measures in the DCPs. And then finally, kind of an average there on that final column of what stage those measures would occur in. Next slide. So, continuing on drought preparations in Region C. So, numerous entities have DCPs, which also include emergency response stages. They also have emergency action plans. Some of those activities are, you'll see on bullet number 2 there, but like emergency interconnects, it'll be like emergency water sales, purchases, and then like transferring water use from, let's say, maybe an industrial use to kind of an emergency municipal use. And then that final bullet there, Region C has developed model DCPs for entities not required to have a DCP or not buying water from a wholesaler or a major water provider that would encourage or enforce use of a DCP for them. And I know that those used to be on the Region C website. They might be there. I know they had updated their website, but those are also in the Region C Regional Water Plan. And I think that is all that I have.
Yes, thank you so much, Kevin, for sharing with us. We have a few minutes for questions. I see one that just came in. What criteria triggered the implementation of DCPs in Region C, and are we entering a drought now?
So, there are multiple DCPs. I think a common trigger, particularly with the major water providers and wholesale providers, are going to be reservoir levels. I'm not specifically familiar on the water levels on in the reservoirs for those providers. Certainly I'm aware, I think we all are, that this past year was a dry year, was a drought year. It's certainly drier than the these last couple of years that we had, which I think we would all call kind of wet years. And so I don't know, but I have a feeling that we might be finding out here shortly.
Great, thank you. Maria would like to know if you have any ideas on how to manage developments who want to include 1, large-scale waterfall features at entry signs, and 2, large lagoons. How would you manage those developments?
Well, I mean, in the context of drought.
Yes, that's what I believe.
Sure.
And
Okay.
making sure that we're being
I mean,
conservative with the water supply
yeah,
still.
it was hard to see. I had a table there, and I'm sorry, it was hard to see. But that is certainly one of the measures. And I had mentioned kind of the priorities is capping irrigation use, but there are and if you were to look on that list, there are measures specifically that address I guess I would kind of call supplemental water use, and they're probably down there at the bottom there, but they're in there, and I'm sorry, again, it's hard to see there.
And then Blake had a comment, triggers are specific to each utility. The Upper Trinity water has been in stage 1 of its DCP since June 2022 due to infrastructure limitations. So that seems to be answering the first question that we received, but that's good information to know. Thank you so much for that, Blake. Any further questions for Kevin? Okay, well, wonderful. Thank you so much. We're nearing the end of our time and we need to wrap up today's presentation. As a reminder, I will email the link to the slides from today's presentation to all who submitted an RSVP. Later on, I will also send a link to the recording once that is ready for us. If you would like to receive those emails, and again, you did not RSVP, you are welcome to contact me at anox@nctcog.org. I'm going to include that again in the chat for your information. Right here. Oh, there we go. I'm also going to put a survey in the chat so you can provide NCTCOG with your honest feedback on today's webinar. You can click on the screen to get the survey. We really appreciate the responses because they help us improve webinars in the future. So let me get that for you and I will include that. That will also be sent out in the follow-up email as well. I want to thank everyone who joined us today to listen, and many, many thanks to our speakers, Glenn Clingenpeel, Dr. Kathy Jack, Dr. Fouad Jaber, and Kevin Smith for taking time to share their expertise with us this morning. This webinar is now over. I hope that you have a great day. Thank you.